この番組はご覧のスポンサーの提供でお送りします。ご支援者様のお名前は動画の途中で記載されます。
Episode 5 opens from the perspective of the bottom of a teacup looking up at Callie as she's about to pour a freshly made kettle. She winces, however, as Blake's loud, furious voice screams in her direction, though Callie's face remains composed otherwise. Blake is in utter disbelief that Gira would choose his own wife to be captain of the guard and militia, asking how he can justify such blatant nepotism considering that this is the exact kind of corruption he spent the better part of his life fighting. Gira is calmly sipping at his wife's tea, not paying much mind to Blake, and in fact outright ignoring her as he turns to Callie and asks if she's done something different with her tea today since it tastes sweeter. Blake shouts at them not to ignore her, and Sun, who's seated at the table across from them, agrees that the tea does taste sweeter. Kinda likes it. Blake snaps at him to back her up, and he just shrugs, saying that the tea is in fact nice. She pinches her nose and breathes to calm herself, taking a languid sit at the table next to Sun, who pours her a cup with his tail. Blake states more calmly this time that Gira should know how messed up the situation is. Gira finally replies to her saying this was the only move he could make. The person the Elder Council were most heavily considering was a White Fang sympathizer and would have put a kibosh on the investigation. He needed to choose a candidate quickly and make his veto of their decision known. And who is there more trustworthy than his beloved wife? Callie gives a small mom wave before returning to her tea. Blake doubles down that this is how deep-seated corruption starts, with necessary actions, but Sun speaks up and hijacks the conversation by pointing out that it's doubly weird to choose Blake's mom. Like, why choose her of all people? The three cat faunas turn and give Sun a confused look. He blinks and asks if he's missing something. Blake replies that Callie was once captain of the militia decades ago, and Callie waves off that statement, telling Blake not to say it like that. It makes her sound like an old woman, though it was almost 20 years back. Sun sputters his tea, wiping his mouth in surprise, asking if she really was captain. Blake rolls her eyes, saying of course she was. She's still wearing the formal guard uniform. Sun's eyes bulge, stating with disbelief that that is the formal guard uniform, and Callie responds that it's had a few modifications for everyday use, but she's always loved the way it hugged her figure. Blake is about to point out that she herself has worn an outfit like that for the formal events, before realizing Sun never actually went to those formal events, and has quite possibly never seen a woman in dress uniform. Gira regains control of the conversation and says that with Callie's prior work, she was a natural fit and easily overqualified. Besides, this will possibly push people towards favoring the Democratic Council movement that he's been a major proponent of the last few years. Having blatant corruption in the face of the populace might spur people to push for change in the system. Blake challenges that the only change that might happen is Gira's removal from office, but he says that it's a risk he's willing to take. There is a known active terrorist threat that has already tried to undermine the leadership of Menagerie and attempted an assassination on his family. If extreme action isn't warranted now, then when? And while he appreciates the good he can do while in office, his family comes first, as does the well-being of his people. Blake sighs and puts her head in her hands, giving Sun the room to ask why Callie left the position in the first place. She and Gira have a sappy parent moment where they lean together and say that she fell in love. And with Gira being a major political activist, it made it hard to be impartial. Ultimately, she chose to have a family with him over her career. Gira moves the conversation along again, saying this appointment may only end up being temporary. If the council vote unanimously to override him, the appointment will be overturned. Luckily, there's a few voices of reason among the elders, at least for now, so they'll have a little time to work with. He projects something like 2 or 3 months at least. If they work hard enough, it should be enough time to figure out what the White Fang are trying to do in the long run and find a way to stop it. Blake is amazed at how flippant they're being at the possibility of losing their jobs and positions, but Callie shrugs that off. A job, an appointment, those things usually wind up being temporary no matter what. She and Gira will still have each other, they'll still have Blake, and they'll still have their home. Well, what's left of it. The situation still doesn't sit well with Blake. Her mom being a yes man for Gira makes her stomach roil. At that, Callie gets indignant, saying she was captain of the guard for years before marrying Gira, and Blake should know better than to think she'd just follow his orders blindly. Blake points out that she's never seen the two of them disagree, not on anything serious, and Gira turns that around, saying that's because they talk through their problems before deciding on a solution. They don't always agree on the approach, but they agree on a unified approach in the end, even if neither of them are happy about it. Bad optics as it is, Callie says that it's the best decision they have on the table. With no one else to trust and the guard needing a captain, this was the only good choice they had. Blake is still uneasy about this, and Gira replies, "Well, you shouldn't. It's completely out of your control. You'll just have to live with your mom outranking you." All eyes fall to Callie as she grins mischievously. And for our first official act, Let's arrange a playdate. The camera zooms in on the bookshelf behind Callie, where we see the spine of a copy of A Man with Two Souls. We transition smoothly to a gloved hand pulling the copy off a shelf. There's a distant ticking sound, and we pan past a nearby clock. The camera refocuses on the now open book and zooms out to show Adam Torres, reading it to pass the time in his private chambers, dressed down for comfort. He wears a neutral expression, but as time fades on through the miracle of montage, he gets more and more frustrated. Eventually, he looks at the clock, which is now hours ahead of where we last saw it, and with a yell, he throws the book at the wall. Standing, he approaches the door and hears Blake's voice echoing off the book that he's an animal. He pauses, walks over to the book, picks it up, and puts it back on the table gingerly. He walks back to the door and opens it into the hallway. It opens into a dramatically different location than the White Fang HQ, a sterile, cold, and claustrophobic kitchenette of an apartment. The camera angles are all Dutch, and there's a slight glow to everything, letting us know this isn't quite real. Adam walks through the door, noticing 2 pairs of shoes at the entrance, and passes the table holding an empty medicine bottle with an attached handwritten note that says "Refill ASAP" in big bold letters. Adam hears noises from a nearby room and moves to open the door. The noises, though hard to discern, get louder, and a woman's voice can be heard shouting Adam's name in surprise. The vision fades as a male voice begins to talk, and we blink back to reality, where Adam has opened the door from the hallway to another part of the base. Amook is telling him that the menagerie forces have arrived, or what's left of them. Adam asks the man to elaborate, and he explains that apparently the coup attempt in Menagerie failed, and most of the White Fang and Kuokuwana have been arrested pending further investigation. Those that made it back barely slipped by the harbor patrols as is. As far as they can tell, the White Fang has lost its foothold in Menagerie. Adam, stone-faced, looks to the man before turning around and slamming the door. The door slam is our transition to the door slamming on the interrogation cell of the Kuokuwana Guard HQ. Ilya jumps as Callie leans forward across from her. Ilya laughs awkwardly and says it's strange to meet Mrs. Belladonna here, but Callie smoothly deflects the comment, saying it's not unusual to see family friends from time to time, now is it? Ilya looks to raise a question about that statement, but Callie transitions into asking her about her friends, particularly the people she works with in the White Fang. Ilya is even more confused now, and what follows is a montage of scenes as we hop back and forth between Callie interviewing Ilya and intermittently interviewing Trifa, Yuma, and Corsic. During each Ilya segment, we get a commentary on one of the three's personality quirks, while in the follow-up scene with that character, we get Callie exploiting that personality quirk. Behind the one-way mirror, Sun remarks to Blake that he never wants to get on her bad side, and Blake just agrees with a muted, shocked nod. All of this comes to a head as Callie manipulates each of the 3 inmates to think that they've been sold out by the others, leading them to spill information that Callie can further exploit. The culmination of this interrogation has Corsic spitting and raving about something called Fenrir, and how it'll consume the world of man, leaving Faunus the only true ruling caste. We cut back to Callie talking with Ilya, and finally she brings up the term Fenrir, quoting Corsic's raving diatribe. Ilya laughs it off. Operation Fenrir was a pipe dream of Kin on Ryu back before he was ousted by Sienna Khan. It was some kind of full-scale coup d'etat in Mistral, but it was never practical because of the scale of land they needed to cover in order to hold the power. Besides, anything they tried would be stopped by Atlas, which just closed its borders, or Vale, who are too busy recovering from the fall of Beacon. Ilya mumbles to herself about logistics and manpower before she goes completely quiet. Finally, she mutters to herself, "Oh my god." Callie smiles and stands, wrapping a warm hand over Ilya's. She says it's clear that Ilya has a lot to think about, and Callie's going to give her time to do it. She should think over what she wants to discuss next before they meet again tomorrow. Ilya just stares at her, visibly disturbed by the prospect of whatever Operation Fenrir truly is. Callie saunters out of the room, though Ilya tries to stop her, wanting to continue talking, that it's important, but Callie just says, "Same time tomorrow. If you really want to talk, we'll have someone give you a pen and paper to write your thoughts down so you don't miss a thing the next time we have a conversation." Still inside the mirror, Sun is banging on the window, begging, "No, no, 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 don't end on a cliffhanger, come on, I hate those!" Blake just mumbles to herself, "How did I get away with anything as a kid?" Gira just says, "Trust me, you didn't, and I had to hear all about it." Callie walks into the room, remarking that this has been quite the productive day, and Sun complains that it's clear that Ilya wants to keep talking. Callie explains that sure, Ilya will talk, and talk, and talk, and tomorrow she'll remember 3 more important things she'll want to talk about. And all that time, they would be chasing their own tails, emphasized by pulling on Sun's tail, following incomplete information. Let Ilya stew on it, write her thoughts down, compose herself, and tomorrow they'll have just about everything they need to know. For now, They just have to wait. The four of them go quiet, watching Ilya get taken out of the room back to her cell, and then Gira broaches the idea of clocking out early and getting dinner, to which everyone but Sun readily agrees. Sun is still in shock over everything, trying to process it, and complains that leaving off on a note like that is just like an episode of your favorite show cutting to black. And in the middle of him saying the word black, the episode ends. The next episode opens with muffled talking, as Weiss slowly wakes up. She only opens her eyes briefly before a leg passes in front of her and she closes them again, pretending to still be unconscious. Around her is a heated, muffled discussion, and very quickly the voices come into focus as we realize Weiss is laying on the ground, having been tied at the ankles and with her arms behind her back. The first clear voice we hear is a man's voice saying they need to bury the body soon or else the sacrilege will start to upset the tribe. They've already begun prepping the body. A woman's voice, Raven's, acknowledges this, and orders them to take care of it as soon as the largest debris has been removed from the ruins. After that, they can strip it for parts. Sacrilege or not, that scrap will be useful. A second female voice asks, "What do you think we should do with her?" And Weiss tenses since she knows who they're talking about. Raven says that, ideally, they'll just kill her and be done with it, but the second woman says that they can't do that, and the man quickly agrees that one unnatural death is already one too many. Raven sighs and says that she knows, but it doesn't make it any less annoying. We see her feet enter frame as she stands over Weiss and asks, "What do you think, Schnee?" Weiss opens her eyes to look up at Raven's figure towering over her. She appraises her surroundings. They're inside the heart of an encampment of yurts among a crowd of bustling bandits who are all scurrying about to take care of different jobs. Most only spare Weiss a passing glance, but a small throng stand before her, led by Raven, who is flanked by two more distinct members. The first is Shady Man, or as he's been renamed in this fixing, Shiloh Man, in order to kind of obfuscate the pun a little bit. Writers, listen to me. In a show that already has several on-the-nose names, you can't just throw one at us that just is the nose. The second is a young woman around Weiss's age, with tan skin, a red color scheme, and black and brown hair peppered with white lilies. Weiss looks at the group of bandits nervously before seeing a ritually wrapped body not too far from where they are. Pilot's boy's helmet placed atop its chest. Weiss's face quickly cycles through horror, crestfallen, and then apprehension. Raven, seeing this reaction, says the man died in the crash. She should be happy he's going to be getting a burial at all. That little stunt of theirs ended up doing quite a bit of damage. Weiss tries to sit up, but winces against her restraints, saying, "Well, sorry, next time I crash an airship, I'll pick a more convenient location for you." The younger woman snaps, "Watch it! Your crash damaged our ruins." Weiss digests what was just said and blinks, replying, "They're ruins. How can you tell?" Raven rolls her eyes and says, "Lesions." Weiss glares at Raven and says, "How do I know I can trust your word? For all I know, you killed him. You were just talking about killing me." Shiloh speaks up and says, "You're not gonna be killed here, kid. We're bandits, not savages." He turns to Raven. "Honestly, I don't think we have a lot of options here. Either she stays with us, or we send her into the forest on her own." Raven replies, "I don't like either of those options, but you're right." Raven uses her foot to lift Weiss's chin. "Even if we set her free, wouldn't feel right to chase her down and kill her after she survived that crash. As much damage as she did to the ruins, that was impressive work." The girl next to her shrugs. "Could be useful. She might be a pampered princess, but if she can fight, she might be able to hold her own here." Raven uses her toe to appraise Weiss's face before dropping it and stepping back. "That's true." Raven pauses in thought before squatting down to be close to eye level with Weiss. "Look here, princess." Weiss cuts in, "Eris." And Raven continues, "I don't care. You're on thin ice. I want you dead. And I can't kill you so long as you're here. So here's what will happen. You're going to be staying with us until we move camp again. If you play nice, we'll leave you here alive, and you can go on your merry way. If you don't, we'll throw you into the woods and use you as target practice." Raven stands. "Either way, I wouldn't stray too far from camp if I were you." Weiss glares up at Raven and asks, "So what? Am I going to get my own little tent? Please tell me they come with air conditioning. Or a fan." Shiloh also looks to Raven, giving a shrug. "Actually, that's a good point. Not about the air conditioning part, but where are we going to put her up? Not like we have any spare tents lying around." Raven crosses her arms and considers the situation. "Good question. Vernal, she'll be staying with you." The girl next to Raven jumps in place, groaning, "What? Mom?" Raven waves a dismissive hand through the air as she walks off. "You vouched for her, now she's your problem." The other collected tribe members seem to take this order in stride and begin to disperse, leaving Weiss alone with Vernal. Vernal is just staring after Raven, and Weiss manages to sit up on her knees. She sighs and mumbles, "How do I even get myself into these things?" which attracts Vernal's attention. The two lock eyes for a heated second, Vernal glaring at Weiss. Lacking anything better to say to break the awkward tension, Weiss drawls out, "So, who does your hair?" Vernal groans and walks away. Weiss manages to hop up on her tied feet and begs, "Hey, wait, at least untie me!" As she hops after Vernal, her body obscures the camera. A moment later, the camera is unobscured by a bowl being lowered down, and we are now in a sushi bar and menagerie watching as Blake, her family, and Sun walk through the front doors. They're drenched from head to toe, and Sun complains, only to see the bright side that a shower during a brisk walk is a great way to wake up after a long day at work. He turns to find the entire Belladonna family, wet cats, glaring at him. He shrivels under their gaze and quickly distracts himself with finding them a booth. The three watch him go before Callie and Blake look at each other. Callie sticks a bit of hair behind Blake's ears so it's not stuck to her face, and giggles at the sight of her waterlogged daughter. The three follow Sun to a booth that he's waving from and sits down. Sun stretches and says that whenever he gets back to Mistral, it's going to be weird. He's so used to the restaurant serving him right off the bat, he might be rusty sneaking into places. Gira asks if he's had to do that often, and Sun thinks on it, counting on his hand before stopping and saying it'd be easier to tell Gira the times he doesn't have to do that. Gira mutters to himself that discrimination in Mistral must really have gotten bad in his absence, but Sun waves that off, saying, "Nah, that's only like half the time. The other half I'm just broke." Scarlet was always so crabby about the team's allowances. Or maybe that was just mine. Gira grips the bridge of his nose in frustration, and Blake is bewildered that the students of Haven got an allowance. Sun is surprised that the Beacon kids didn't get one, and here we learn a little bit about what distinguishes the schools from each other. At Beacon, materials are typically provided to the students unless budgeting was a specific part of the curriculum, while at Haven the teams had quarterly allowances for their own supplies and equipment. Considering Mistral is the most economically oriented of the kingdoms, money management would be a key component of their teaching structure. Gira asks if Sun got less allowance because he was a faunus or if it was because he was bad with money, and Sun says he was just bad with money. Honestly, the whole discrimination thing never really rang true to him. Sure, the city has its fair share of stores faunus aren't allowed in, but on campus everyone was equal for the most part. I mean, he says, Lionheart is the headmaster of Haven, a council member. He's one of the most powerful men in the world. And, like, he's the best one. I mean, Osmond had that whole mystery teacher vibe going on, but Lionheart would sit down with students and work out their problems. Guy was always super honest, and he'd take a bullet for anyone. Callie remarks that he seems like a reliable man, and Gira agrees, humming in approval of Osmond's eye for talent. Blake, however, asks if Sun's glowing appraisal isn't just because Lionheart would let some of Sun's shenanigans slide. Sun takes offense to that and says that it's only a little bit of the reason he's so appreciative of Lionheart. As Sun finishes speaking, a waiter arrives and asks what they'd like to order. We pass behind the waiter's back and we slide out from behind Vernal's back in the bandit camp, as one of the bandits sneers at her that he doesn't take orders from her. She returns that he takes orders from her mom, and unless he wants his ass on a pike, he better do what she says. She begins to draw a blade at her waist, and the guy panics for a moment before rushing to clean up the space around him, which is littered with empty cans and cartons of bygone drinks and food. Weiss pokes her head out of a nearby yurt, and for the first time we get a good look at the bandit camp. Instead of being the absolutely insane log wall enclosure military tent encampment, which looks ugly as sin, the Branwen bandit camp is now taking keys from a number of different cultures. In specific, we're invoking Mongolian and Ainu cultures. The tents are now Mongolian yurts, which all circle a nearby Misty Lake. As far as anyone can tell, there's no obvious defenses against the wilderness, though there is a reason for that we'll touch on later. The outfits and air of the tribe have only a fraction of that Mad Max-inspired biker gang aesthetic, though that's still definitely present. Instead, it pulls more from the Ainu, the native peoples of Japan. Weiss raises a brow at Vernal and says, "Isn't killing against the rules here?" Vernal sneers at her and says, "Killing is. Hurting is another story entirely. Sometimes it takes a little extra motivation for slobs to pick up after themselves." Weiss sympathizes. She used to have a roommate that was pretty slovenly. She'd always eat snacks in bed and hang posters with thumbtacks instead of frames. She actually shivers at the thought of it. Vernal glares at Weiss and tells her to stop. "You might be sane with me, and I might have stood up for you, but we're not friends. Don't pretend that we are." Weiss gives Vernal a confused stare. "I was just trying to make polite conversation." Vernal puts a hand on her hip and says, "Well, that's to be expected of a pampered princess." Weiss replies, "Eris, actually." Vernal asks what the difference is, and Weiss has to actually pause and think about it for a moment, never having to actually describe that before. Ultimately, she lands on the differences not mattering. She's not even an heiress anymore. Vernal says that's a shame, but it'll make Weiss stronger in the long run. What's the point in inheriting someone else's accomplishments? Weiss points out that Vernal just invoked Raven's name to get someone to do something. Vernal says that she can back all that up. Her mother's name is inherited strength, not inherited success. Weiss just shrugs, sarcastically saying, "Whatever you say." Vernal asks if Weiss has a point with coming out of her tent, and Weiss says that she was thinking about going for a walk around camp. She's already been in the tent for a couple of hours and it's driving her stir crazy. Vernal taunts the little princess for not having any patience, and Weiss's face twitches with frustration before settling. She composes herself and asks if it's alright if she walks around the camp. Vernal says that her mother is being too lenient with Weiss, with no guards. And Vernal doesn't exactly trust her to not steal something and run away. Weiss asks if that's what Vernal would do, and Vernal responds, haughtily, that she would, and Weiss wouldn't know it till she had gotten away scot-free. Regardless, it's probably best if Vernal keeps an eye on Weiss. As a compromise, Vernal offers to show Weiss around the camp during her rounds, though she warns, some of the folks here bite. Weiss accepts with a touch of hesitation. They begin their walk, and along its length, Vernal will occasionally shout orders for someone to clean up their yurt or to move something around, often getting frustrated in the process. During this, Weiss begins to ask Vernal questions, asking exactly what this tribe does. Vernal is frank when she says that Raven was telling the truth. They're bandits. Or at least that's what people call them, she supposes. It's a name they, like much else, took for themselves. Apparently it carries a pretty negative connotation out in civilized society, but to the tribe it's just a way of life. If you can't protect what you hold most dear, you don't deserve to have it. Weiss raises a brow that they steal things for a living, but Vernal is quick to correct her. They don't steal, they take. Stealing is just a concept made by the weak to persuade the gullible. Weiss shakes her head at that, but doesn't attempt to voice any opposition just to keep the peace. She does, however, ask if that's why they took Myrtnaster away from her. Vernal looks at her curiously before it dawns on her that Weiss is talking about her sword. Vernal says yes, but before she can go into detail about it, another bandit jogs up to Vernal, calling her Little Branwen as a nickname. They look to find Shiloh approaching, and Vernal stomps her foot, telling him to stop calling her that. He slows his jog to a stop and he rubs the back of his head, apologizing. Regardless, he came over to tell her that they're about to go on a raid of one of the nearby towns and asks her if she wants in. She seems to debate it, only to look to Weiss and give a frustrated sigh. She passes on the opportunity, saying she has to lug this deadweight around. Weiss takes exception to that, of course, but Shiloh is understanding, saying they'll have plenty of raids over the next couple of weeks. Vernal begins to smile at that, but expertly hides it away, dismissing him while tersely thanking him for his consideration. He laughs off her hardened exterior and goes to pat her on the head before reconsidering and saying his goodbyes. Vernal grinds her teeth as he leaves, murmuring how she just doesn't get that clown. Weiss watches the scene, not really sure what to make of it, before redirecting Vernal back to her original question. Seemingly relieved to be focusing on something else, Vernal casually remarks that, oh yeah, her mom took Weiss's little toothpick. Weiss asks why, and we cut to a distant shot of the camp followed closely by a loud, shrieking, "What?" We next cut to Raven tending a turkey over a fire, a turkey that's suspended from an impromptu spit made out of Myrtnaster. She's humming a little tune to herself as Weiss comes barreling over to her face absolutely red and infuriated. Vernal is close behind, a touch of surprise on her face over Weiss's sudden outburst. Weiss points an accusatory finger at Raven, shouting, "How dare you besmirch a family heirloom!" Raven pauses while turning the spit to look up at Weiss, unflinching in the face of Weiss's impressive screaming. Raven scoffs, laughing at the very notion of a family heirloom. Weiss is unmoved by Raven's dismissiveness and continues her tirade, explaining that Myrtnaster has been in the Schnee family line since her great-grandfather and has proudly served their lineage to defend the people of Atlas since. Raven starts flapping her hand to mock Weiss's talking, saying blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah and cutting her off. Raven says that talk is cheap, and from her perspective, the sword is hers to do with as she pleases. Weiss again argues that Raven has zero connection to it, but Raven turns it around and asks what would have happened to it should Weiss have died in her little airship crash, like the ship's pilot did. Weiss recoils a little and goes silent. Raven continues that she knows what would have happened. This sword that served so many generations, a lineage of history, would have been found just like it had been here, its pedigree completely lost to the tribe and used as a spit for the rest of its pitiful existence. Sure, maybe it'd be used to kill a rogue Grimm or two, but nothing substantial. Best case scenario, it becomes a cooking implement. Worst case, it gets discarded and forgotten. And Weiss would just be another corpse on the pile, powerless to do anything about it. Weiss is shaking at this point, and after a pause, she quietly seethes for Raven to give it back. Raven asks her to speak up, and Weiss does, ordering her to give it back. Raven cocks her head to the side and says, "Make me." Weiss continues to shudder before bowing her head and muttering, "Please." Raven laughs, pointing to how the mighty princess of Atlas has fallen, asking a petty bandit for her weapon back. Well, no, she's not getting it back. Weiss looks up and says, "I'm not a princess, I'm an heiress." and I wasn't asking, I was being polite. From behind Raven comes the blade of Weiss's knight, lining up to Raven's throat. Raven looks at Weiss in surprise, and the entire clearing freezes. We see Vernal reaching for her knife and the surrounding tribe moving towards their weapons. And then Raven laughs. She flips the hilt in her hand and holds it out for Weiss to take, which she does. Once Myrtnaster is safe in hand, Weiss dismisses her summon. To that, Raven applauds her backbone before she steps closer and says that if Weiss ever threatens Raven again, she'll eat every word she's ever said and the tip of her own blade. Weiss stares her straight in the eye, and we see a flash of fear before she hardens and replies, "Make me." She then lifts the turkey on Myrtnaster to her lips and bites an entire chunk out of it. A second later, she spits it back out because it's too hot to eat. Again, Raven begins to laugh, and soon the surrounding tribe does as well, including Vernal. And through that laughter, we transition to the Menagerie sushi bar where the Belladonnas are laughing at Sun scraping his tongue and saying it's too hot. Blake hands him some water and says that she told him that Menagerie Fire Snapper was a bad idea. Gira, however, commends him on trying new things, though Callie wryly adds they're lucky he doesn't seem to be allergic to it. Sun coughs in surprise that there's an allergy that could come from this, but Blake shoves another glass of water in his face with a frown at her mother. The waiter comes back around and asks if there will be anything else. They say no, and Gira takes the check, heading up to the register telling his family they'll be leaving in a couple of minutes. He just wants to make sure they've paid. He leaves, and shortly afterwards, Blake catches wind of a drunk patron complaining about the new restrictions already coming down at work since that damned cat lady took over the captain's seat on the guard. He continues that the damned husband of hers is playing politics with their lives and slowing down the trade coming out of the port. Blake is frustrated by the commentary, and after a few more snide remarks, she stands to confront the patron, with Sun and Callie trying in vain to stop her. She stomps over to the table in what progresses as an argument that slowly gets out of hand. Blake argues that Callie is perfectly suited to the position. The guy argues back that she's killing the shipping industry at the worst possible time by having every ship on Menagerie searched, and sprinkled in there is an escalation of insults that end with Gira being called a lapdog politician and Callie his little bit. And before the man can finish the word, Blake lunges at him, only for Sun to pull her back. During this, Callie has remained seated at the booth, quietly trying to ignore or otherwise stay out of the argument. Sun quickly tells Blake that hitting this guy will solve nothing, even if he is being a complete ass about things. The guy complains to Sun that it's bullshit he's the ass when it's their livelihoods that's being snuffed out, and Blake shoots back that there's actual lives being snuffed out by the White Fang. Finally, Callie slams her hands down on the table and tells both sides to step away. She recognizes that the situation is currently bad for everyone, but they're working very hard to solve it as fast as possible, and fighting like this will not help anyone. Gira arrives to collect his family and asks what's going on. Callie grabs Blake by the arm and drags her towards the door, saying that nothing is going on and that it's about time they get home. Gira looks to Sun and the man, the former who shrugs and the latter who glares. Gira hardens his stare at the man before Sun tugs them towards the door. Blake and Callie exit the door into the stormy night. The camera pans to the clouds and we transition into a clear moonlit sky at the bandit camp, panning down to where Weiss has just left the tent flap of Vernal's yurt. Night at the bandit camp is quiet and peaceful, with the air clean and the stars clearly visible above, framing the shattered moon. There's a quiet chanting happening in the distance, and Weiss follows it, coming to the lakeshore where the entirety of the tribe has gathered. Most seem to be praying out towards the center of the lake, where now visible are a series of small islands upon which rest ruins very reminiscent of those last seen in the Emerald Forest. Leaning against her own yurt, nearest the shoreline, is Raven, who seems disinterested in the prayers of her people, and Vernal, who's idly chipping away at a small block of wood with a knife. Raven shakes her head and enters her yurt, and Vernal moves to follow, packing up her whittling kit, only to pause, turn towards the ruins, cup her hands, and bow her head for only a few seconds. Weiss watches this moment of quiet reverence as Vernal picks up her head and sees the Schnee staring at her. Vernal blushes and hurriedly goes inside Raven's yurt. Weiss gives a bemused smile and turns to look at the lake as fireflies begin to light up around the islands, illuminating an imposing cherry blossom tree at the center. The screen darkens, leaving us with only the glow of the fireflies, and then those two fade, ending the episode. And on that warm and fuzzy note, I'd like to give a shout out to some of my wonderful new patrons. A warm welcome around the bonfire to 7R1133N. That's probably actually says something, but I am too dumb to read leet speak. Luna Rose, Mr. Mixel, Aaron Smith, and Observer. It's with your guys' help that this project stays afloat, along with all the other patrons that have supported me over the years. I want to give a hearty thank you to everyone that's been there for me, and I hope that I've given you the quality content you've been looking for. Remember that for $1 or more, you too can support this channel and gain access to the Team Frostbite Discord server, the Tundra. where myself, Fatman Falling, Dashi Lee, Molly Rhymemaster, and other prominent RWBY community members are regularly active, such as the Sketchy Huntsman. We just love having new people on the server, and I would personally love to see you in there, especially during regular community events such as Bad Fanfiction Night, which I host every Friday night. That's all from me for now. Back to your regularly scheduled fixing. Episode 7 begins very similarly to how the first steps began in Volume 1, with Nora, Ren, Jean, and Ruby going through their morning routine in a comedic montage format, all overlaid with Ruby talking about the investigation they're setting out to accomplish for the day. Her stated goal? Investigate key locations around the city in order to locate leads on the Branwen tribe, including the police station, the local hunters guild, and the library. At the end of the montage, the four of them are lined up and yell, "Banzai!" to initiate the beginning of their search. However, just behind Nora is Roman, who has mockingly joined the group and cheering along. Nora, surprised, reflexively elbows him in the stomach and sends him sprawling. Nora, with a bit of bite to her words, apologizes for her reflexes, and John asks what Roman is doing there. He cheekily retorts that he's one of the crew now, isn't he? They can't leave him out of all the fun activities. Ruby says this isn't some game, they need to find the Branwens as soon as possible. From behind her, Crow speaks up, saying, "You're sure making it look like a game," before hitting his flask. He elaborates that with that plan, all they'll come out with is a handful of cold shoulders and a library card. If they want to investigate that way later, fine, but he's got methods with a proven track record, and they're going to tag along to see what real huntsman work is like. The group's spirits dampen, but Ren is optimistic. After all, they're still technically in training, so they should just consider this another learning opportunity. They did only ever get one chance to shadow a huntsman in the field, and that was interrupted by the breach. We focus in on his hopeful face and smash cut to a more sobered one as we reveal the group are sitting inside of a half-empty bar, observing Crow as he drinks what appears to be a second shot of 2 next to a window. John crosses his arms and asks how this is an effective investigation tactic. Crow's about to respond when Ruby jumps in and defends him with a mix of hope and growing doubt, saying, No, it's just like a gritty detective novel, going to a seedy bar to find shady characters that might give away the nefarious plans of the grisly underworld." The camera pans over to Roman, who's sipping a Long Island iced tea. Catching her stare, he asks, "What?" Crow cuts in and says that huntsman work is nothing like that. What you read in the books is garbage. Nora asks, "Well then what are we sitting around here for?" And Crow just replies, "We're just watching." All eyes go to the window, and then to outside the window where a barmaid is serving drinks to a handful of patrons. The group as a whole scowl back at Crow, except Roman, who just mockingly says, "Good taste," while sipping his drink. Ruby nudges him in the side. However, as a background detail that most people will only pick up on a second viewing, there's a major gate out of the city beyond the barmaid, crowded with trade caravans. Ren shrugs his shoulders and says, "Well, at the very least, the atmosphere is pleasant." And this is when Crow stands, declaring that they're done here and it's time to move on. Ren blinks and briefly protests that his oolong tea hasn't even arrived yet, and Crow says they'll get him some at the next place. John remarks, "Next place?" And we pop over to an entirely different bar, though the table arrangement is almost exactly the same, only aesthetics have really changed. John rolls his eyes and groans, "Oh, you gotta be kidding me." There's silence as Crow continues to stare out the window, and Nora quietly asks Ruby if her uncle is okay. Ruby hesitantly asks him if maybe they should try some different venues, kinda shake things up instead of just bar hopping. And Crow responds that if she wants to do her own investigation, she's free to do it, but he has his methods and he's not changing them. Ren hums and says that they should trust that he knows what he's doing, and Nora complains Ren's only happy because he got his tea. Ren shoots back that she's only upset because they stopped serving breakfast past noon. John crosses his arms and asks if Crow's methods are drowning at the bottom of his glass, and Crow just shoots him a glare before looking back out the window. Roman finally speaks up, saying, "As much as I'd love to watch this guy pickle himself, I've got some ideas that I could hit up on, so if you'll excuse me." He stands to leave, but Nora stands to stop him from leaving the table. John asks where Roman thinks he's going, and Roman appeals to their team camaraderie to let him do his part. It isn't like he's going to run, he found them after all. Ruby sighs and volunteers to go with Roman to make sure he doesn't get into any trouble, and while they express concern, she insists. She turns to John and asks him to make sure Crow gets home safely, and they share a knowing look. Roman asks if Ruby is sure she wants to come with him. After all, he's a criminal, right? They're gonna have to stick to the alleys and go deal with the criminal underbelly. Ruby just says, exasperated, "I've dealt with you this whole time, haven't I?" And Roman laughs, leading them out the door. After a moment of silence at the table, Ren turns to his 2 remaining teammates and says that he brought cards. Outside, Ruby is storming off into the crowded streets, clearly frustrated by Crow, and Roman lazily comments that she's going the wrong way. She turns and asks, with a bit of edge, which way should they be going? He explains that often the heart of a problem has a lot of pesky things around it that make it hard to reach, so he needs more roundabout methods to get to it. In order to get to the root, you have to start with the leaf. In order to get to the bottom of things, he points up at the Chochin, you have to start at the top. The camera follows his finger and zooms in on Haven, flying apart and giving us a nice broad view of the locale before zooming in on the student housing. We see Ruby and Roman walking along the scenic trail outside of the dorms, and Ruby is in awe of the view. She asks what exactly they're doing up there. How does student housing tie into fighting the Brandwins? Roman replies it doesn't, they're here to tie up loose ends. When he was working for Cinder, he really didn't get a lot of time to ask questions, and knowing she and the kids were at Mistral means they probably left something behind. And if they can use that something to figure out where Cinder and her cabal have holed up, they can completely bypass the whole Maiden situation and just nip the problem in the bud. No need to bodyguard someone who's not going to get attacked. Ruby has a touch of trouble following the logic, but ultimately agrees to it. We cut to the inside of a dorm room, and outside we can hear Roman saying that this should be the room according to the student registry. There's a brief clicking sound, and Ruby remarks, "Of course you can lockpick." Roman replies, "Of course I can. People keep putting things I want behind doors. And right now, I want whatever is behind this one." The door swings open and Roman flicks the light on for the room, finding it completely empty of even the most basic furniture. Roman and Ruby blink and he says, "And it's empty." Well, didn't expect that, but happens more often than you'd think. Ruby hangs her head at another dead lead and Roman pats her back, strolling out the other direction, telling her not to give up. This was just plan A and it honestly was a long shot. Ruby turns to him and asks, "Well then, what's plan B?" walking out the door's frame. We cut to Nora in a different bar, raising a card dramatically in a mirror of Yang from Volume 2, declaring, "Empty pursuit!" and slamming it to the table. John groans and throws down his hands, saying, "All my hard work down the drain." Ren pats him on his back and says that victory should never be built to, it should only be found in the flow of chance, before laying down an unexpected fortune, which trumps Nora's play and wins him the game. Nora complains how unbalanced the game is, saying he's lucky they're not playing by standard rules or else that'd be outlawed. John shakes his head and looks to Crow, who's by a window, watching and drinking with 3 empty glasses before him. John rolls his eyes and asks to play the deck Ren's using this time. We cut back to Ruby pestering Roman to admit that he doesn't have a clue what he's doing. We see they're walking the streets of Lower Mistral now, not quite the slums, but definitely not the most pleasant area in the city, what with the shoddier buildings and patches of untamed foliage nearby. Roman rebuffs her, saying this is how good digging always goes. Most leads turn up dry until you find one that hits pay dirt. It's a numbers game, really. He smoothly tells her to keep her eyes peeled. There's always been rumors of a White Fang stronghold around this part of the city. It was always something touching on his radar, but since he didn't have any dealings with a Fang before his time in Vale, he never looked too deeply into it. Ruby says it shouldn't be too hard, they just had to look for a whole bunch of faunus in one place, right? Roman raises a brow and points to the crowds around them. Most, if not all of them, are faunus. Ruby gives a weak, "Oh," and Roman snickers that searching for the White Fang in Mistral's biggest faunus quarter won't exactly be easy. There's some irony here, as most of their conversation is backdropped by the chop shop in one way or another the whole scene. Ruby groans that this is turning out to be a lot more frustrating than she'd hoped, and asks how he can be so flippant about all of it. Roman asks exactly how difficult she thought this be. Look at it from the outside in. They're trying to help an immortal wizard trapped in his head track down a bandit tribe where they need to convince some kind of sorceress to flee the country or else someone might use her to open a big magic door. If anything, he asks how any of them can be serious about the whole thing. It sounds ridiculous on paper. Ruby stops in her tracks, a wave of conflicted emotions crossing her face before she replies that they lost people. She lost people she cared about during the fall of Beacon. Roman nods along, saying, Right, you were friends with that robot, weren't you?" And Ruby is quick to say that her name was Penny. Roman nods and repeats the name half-heartedly before Ruby continues that she lost Penny and Pyrrha, and so many more people were hurt because of what Cinder did. Her and her team, at least the one she has now, just want to get justice for what happened to the people that mattered to them. And to have crows still treating them like children when they're more than able to help is really dampening her spirits. Roman comments that they're all still children, and Ruby shoots him a dirty glare which he shrugs off almost immediately. He elaborates that they're in the mindset that they're the only ones that really lost people. Take himself for example. He lost someone during the fall, because of Ruby herself no less. And yet he's still got his humor about him despite the setbacks. Ruby deadpans that they were trying to kill her, and he shoots back that he was forced to under duress. And they can both sit there all day blaming other people for what happened all the way back up to Salem, but that won't do anyone much good. His point is that Ruby is getting upset over some pretty predictable roadblocks, and that's probably why her uncle's being so dismissive. Dead ends happen, accept it, go in a different direction, and see what you can find. Can't tell you how many heists I had to just give up on because security was too tight, and sometimes all I had to do was wait for a new opportunity to present itself. Sulking nets you 0 lien in the long run. Ruby digests his words and takes a deep breath, reaffirming herself physically. She nods and acknowledges that he's right. She's being petty. Roman is glad she's in agreement, but she's quick to say that she should still treat this a little more seriously. So far, he's 0-2 when it comes to his ideas. Roman nods and puts a hand to his chin, thinking. He scowls, exhales, and looks to Ruby saying, "Alright, I think I have one more idea of where we can find a lead, but it's not going to be pleasant." Ruby asks, "For me or for you?" And Roman replies, "Depends. How do you feel about spiders?" Ruby cocks her head to the side, asking, "What?" As we smash cut outside of a club called Charlotte's. The two walk inside, and Roman takes a deep whiff of the room, saying, "Ah, the smell of free enterprise." And Ruby crinkles her nose in disgust. She asks what this place is, and Roman says that she can't possibly be that naive, motioning to the room. The camera pans over to the Oriental-themed strip club, and Ruby closes in on herself, presumably out of embarrassment, saying that she's not old enough to go in these places yet. Roman waves that off and says that she's got adult supervision. Besides, there's no shows during the day. He makes his way towards a set of paper doors, saying he hopes some of the girls he knew are still around. Ruby might get along with them since they're all actually quite nice. Knocking on the door, it slides open, guarded by a large imposing man. Roman declares, "Honey, I'm home," and the guard just cocks an eyebrow at him. A voice behind the guard instructs him to let Roman through, and both Ruby and Roman enter the sitting area lined with small porcelain and glass figurines, where a Sudare screen separates the speaker from the rest of the smoke-filled room. Roman gives an exuberant greeting to Little Miss, saying it's been quite a while. Out of the side of his mouth, he tells Ruby to be ready to run, just in case, and Ruby gives him an accused, terrified, "What?" Little Miss calls out Roman, saying how dare he come here. Years without so much as a letter or a phone call, and now he shows up without even a souvenir from Vale? Roman awkwardly laughs it off, saying there wasn't much for him to give after Beacon fell. All the good souvenir shops had already been looted. She hums how unfortunate that is, but it's pleasant to see him, and the several thousand lien he stole from her the last time he was in Mistral. Roman's eye twitches and he calmly counters that he was sure that money was for the Caliban job. She wouldn't have forgotten to pay him, now would she? Little Miss chuckles, dispelling a little bit of the air, and says it's genuinely good to see him again. The streets of Mistral have been far too quiet without his shenanigans. She was concerned about Vale for him and his little friend. Must have been ashamed to lose her, but he seems to be bouncing back alright, pointing from behind the screen at Ruby. Ruby gives a little, "Hey!" Little Miss comments, "Oh, this one speaks? That's new for you, Roman." And Roman replies, "Believe me, it's been an adjustment period," before conversation carries on. With a few more minor pleasantries, Roman gets to the point and says he needs some information, and Little Miss says that he knows her rates. He counters by saying this may be a mutually beneficial exchange. They're looking for the Branwen tribe. Little Miss pauses and asks what they want with them. Roman explains that he's fallen between a rock and a hard place, and someone inside of that tribe is his way out. If there happens to be a substantial amount of collateral damage to the tribe along the way, well, accidents do happen. Behind him, Ruby is playing with one of the porcelain figures on a shelf, a Mistralian geisha. She accidentally snaps its neck and quietly, nervously, places it back on the shelf before anyone can notice. Little Miss is quiet before saying bandits have a way of harassing her mules, the Branwens chief among them now that they're back in the area. She agrees to give him the information as long as he can guarantee the Branwens will at the very least move along again. He readily agrees, and she gives him the location of one of her less valuable smugglers who's lost a few men to the bandits in weeks past. Roman thanks her and moves towards the door, the bodyguard passing him a leaf of paper with the information on it. However, Little Miss warns him that the Branwens are very popular right now. Ruby asks what she means, and she quickly replies that they're not the only ones looking for them, they're just the only ones that didn't pay. Roman and Ruby share a look, and their pace towards the door quickens. Little Miss holds them up at the end, imploring Roman to keep in touch this time around. The duo rush out the door, and we slide by it, transitioning into the front doors of another bar where Crow is drunk off his ass, stumbling outside. Ren is beside him trying to keep him balanced, asking Nora to help. Behind them, John is just rubbing his brow. He pulls out a scroll and sends a message to Ruby asking how her and Roman are doing, and he gets a reply that they seem to have found a lead, but there's a problem. We cut back to Ruby, lowering her scroll as she and Roman look through a broken door. The room is dark, and there's a mangled, shadowy shape on the floor, a trail of blood leading from it to the door. This keeps things tasteful, but implies a level of gore we can't show. We close in on Ruby and Roman, and after a beat, he sighs, asking Ruby if she has any gloves. She says no, and he rolls his eyes, groaning. So we're going to be doing this barehanded then. Great. One more hard cut at the end of the episode shows us Cinder and her posse arriving at the chop shop, and yes, she's still sporting her singular sleeve Phantom of the Opera mask look. Don't worry, it'll be explained, not in Volume 5, but it will get addressed. Meanwhile, Emerald and Mercury are relatively unchanged, barring a quieter streak to Emerald, who appears to be running on limited hours of sleep. Watts asks how their little powwow with the Pinnacle of the Pits went, and Cinder says they traded points, but by the end of things, his eyes were glassing over. Their friends from the Fang stayed behind to explain things to him a little more clearly. Watts hums how unfortunate that is for the man, but so long as they got the information, it's not much of a loss. She did get the information, didn't she? Cinder narrows her eyes at Watts and scoffs that of course she did. He tells her not to get so indignant. She's the one that set the precedent with her failure at Beacon. Emerald steps forward to defend Cinder, growling that she didn't fail at Beacon. She got the Maiden Power and killed Ozpin. Missing a relic doesn't mean she failed. Watts says, of course, because failing to acquire the thing Salem wants most, now that's what success sounds like. And we'll ignore how unfazed she was to learn of Ozpin's death. Cinder is about to respond when Mercury finally steps in, saying it might be fun to bicker for the better part of an hour, but they have plans to make, and they've seen how Salem treats failure. The group react poorly to that statement, all recoiling in their own severity and style, though Emerald's is the most pronounced, openly wincing at the thought. Watts agrees with Mercury and asks if Cinder has the location. She hands over her scroll and says, locations, plural, since the reports within the spider web weren't very well organized. Watts grimaces at the list of locations and says it'll take some time to narrow things down, and they're still going to have to do some searching on foot. All the same, with all the experience she, Emerald, and Mercury have killing huntsmen the last few months, this should be a veritable walk in the park for them. Turning back to his computer, he asks how Cinder feels about doing some community service and wiping a bandit tribe or two from existence. Cinder smiles, and her eyes flash with Maiden Power, the screen going to black, lingering on that glimmer. Episode 8 mirrors the opening of Episode 4 of Fixing Volume 4, using the double doors to enter into the White Fang throne room. The room is packed with White Fang members, and upon his throne sits Adam, fully garbed and gripping his sinuses, obviously overwhelmed at the series of voices flooding the room. As the volume rises, he does as well, slamming Blush and Wilt down onto the ground and yelling for silence. The room dies down into murmurs, and he doubles down, slamming his weapon again and repeating his order. Finally, the hall is quiet. He starts a speech, saying they've all heard the news of the fall of Menagerie's branch. With the loss of Menagerie and the disbandment of Vale's branch that Sienna foolishly committed, he can see how faith has been shaken. This is to be expected, but it is not to be tolerated. Assembled here are the best of the best, true believers in the cause, and to think that some island miles away will take from them the victory they've paved in their blood and sweat is foolish. Menagerie can be retaken, this lapse a mere footnote in the long march towards a true Faunus nation. There's an uproar as the assembled White Fang cheers his declaration. Adam smirks in response, lifting Wilt and Blush above his head. He says that supplies and equipment are still coming in, and as always, Faunus friendly to the cause are always welcome to join. They, as well as everyone in this room, will become the gunshot that starts a worldwide revolution. The chamber erupts in cheering, and Adam slinks off the stage to a side room. On the other side is Hazel, leaning against a wall. He congratulates Adam at getting that under control, but he has to wonder how far a few fancy words can carry him. Adam is adamant that members of the Fang can subsist on words alone. Their loyalty is absolute, and any who would question it have already been dealt with. Hazel raises an eyebrow and asks how Menagerie fell if that's the case, and Adam replies, walking down the hall, that Menagerie had a rogue element, one they won't suffer in Mistral. He walks towards the camera and obscures it, and it's unobscured when a Lien card is pulled away from the camera and rests down beside a rundown sink. Roman is there, splashing his hands in the sink and wiping them free of blood with a towel. He frowns at the sight and grouses that he thought his days of dealing with dead bodies were behind him. Ozpin speaks up in his mind, saying that it's quite the contrary. The bodies only ever seem to keep piling up when Salem is involved. Roman snarks that he's looking forward to it, not like he had plans before all this happened that didn't involve corpses. Ozpin says that Roman doesn't talk about his plans from before all that often, and Roman pauses while drying his hands, replying that they weren't much different than his plans back when they first met in Vale. Him and Neo were going to get out of the biz, one last big score, set for life, find a nice tropical paradise, grow old, and die. Ozpin comments that he doesn't believe that for a second. He only ever gets put in the minds of people who are very much like him, and those who are very much like him always attract trouble. Roman laughs bitterly and asks if Oz is saying he'd never have a peaceful life, and Oz replies it would at the very least not be an uneventful life. Destined to make life difficult. Just great, Roman says, picking up a freshly washed ring from a towel on the counter. He appraises it before setting it aside and looking at a drenched wallet that has flecks of blood on it. He rifles through it and asks what kind of trouble Ozpin is used to getting into, and Ozpin flippantly says, "Oh, you know, stopping wars, ending racial conflict, saving the world." Roman looks deadpan into the mirror and says, "Oh, so a Tuesday night out? You get all of that done on a school night?" Ozpin playfully replies that he was a headmaster. Roman looks over the scattered, partially bloodied effects on the counter and asks, "Well then, headmaster, answer me this. Why would the White Fang kill a member of the Spiderweb?" There's a pause before Ozpin asks back, "What makes you think it was the White Fang?" Roman nods and lifts a number of metal shards to eye level from the pile. He remarks that the blade chippings belong to blades commonly used by the Fang, not to mention some of the claw marks that were present. So either this man had a bad run-in with a bear or the White Fang killed him. The question is why? The man was in the underworld, gambling debts, territorial disputes, even stock standard discrimination. There are any number of possible explanations, Ozpin replies, but Roman shakes those suspicions away. No, you see, if this were an intentional hit from the Fang, they'd make it look like an example. They're always sending a message with their assassinations, and if it were any other reason, they'd make it look like one of their assassinations. He lifts the wallet and slaps it against the counter. And if it were a robbery, they typically would take the cash. This was quick and dirty, so the question remains, why? There is silence before Ozpin comments that, "I didn't quite see the connection that fate had made between us at first, but now I do. You have a rather astute mind." Roman rolls his eyes and says, "Well, flattery will get you everywhere." He tosses the wallet to the pile and rests his hands on the counter. For a second, we get the tired Roman, the real Roman underneath, all the vim and bravado evaporated. So is that the only reason why? Everything you just said about stopping wars and saving the world, that doesn't sound like something I would go near, let alone touch. If you really want someone, why not Red out there? He looks through the door to the bathroom, which is closed, and from beyond we hear Ruby say that she found something, and then the sound of something breaking, followed closely by a squeaky, "Never mind." Ozpin explains that everything he just said comes with a layer of dark realities that someone like Ruby is keenly poised to fight, in her own way. Someone like Ozpin, however, isn't apt to fight that darkness, he's more apt to use it. A mind like mine couldn't survive in an innocent soul, and neither would yours. Roman offers a wry smile, saying, "Who? Me? I'm as pure as the driven snow." There's another crash outside and Ruby says, "That was nothing." Roman groans, slides the loose Lien cards into his pocket, and stomps to the door saying, "Red, I told you to search the room, not to wreck it." The camera pans up into the flickering lights overhead and we fade into the dull fluorescence of the menagerie jail. We pan down as Ilya walks through the hall, being led back to the interrogation room. Blake and Callie sit across from her, and Ilya sets down a full notepad on the table beside her. Callie folds her arms, but gives Ilya a warm smile, asking her about this Operation Fenrir she was so eager to talk about the other day. Ilya looks through her notes and takes a deep breath before starting to speak. Operation Fenrir was a plan by King Onryu charted out shortly before the breach happened. It was part of a collection of ideas he had to try and make quick power grabs across the continent, but the scale just wasn't feasible and most of the plans were scrapped. The idea was to have thousands of White Fang all positioned around the kingdom in massive cells that operated simultaneously for a singular massive coup. But what he didn't want to admit was that we didn't have those numbers, not even close. Sure, we could take those positions, or at least a good chunk of them, but holding them was completely out of the question. Blake asks if this plan was so unworkable, why Ilya is so concerned about it. Ilya quickly answers, Atlas. Callie and Blake are confused, but Ilya continues that organized resistance in Mistral and Anima at large is pretty light. Mostly police, maybe a few scattershot militias. Really, the biggest threats were gangs and crime families. That is, if you discount Atlas, who would no doubt swoop in to reset the board. Vale was also a concern since they'd more than likely try to liberate Mistral from the White Fang, and they could do it. It'd be more difficult for them than for Atlas, with its air superiority and army, but get enough huntsmen and militia in one place and it's a serious threat. Callie and Blake process this and begin to piece it together, out loud. Blake points out that Vale is still reeling from the fall of Beacon, and Callie notes that Atlas has started closing its borders, a complete fleet withdrawal globally. Ilya nods, saying that's exactly the thing she's worried about. Now the numbers don't matter as much. The biggest obstacle they face is reinforcements and an organized resistance from the Mistral Council. But Adam must think it can work. He must have some idea to make it work. Blake stands, her chair screeching back, and she sputters that they need to stop this. Callie, meanwhile, is silent, eyes flickering back and forth as her thumb rises to her lips. She bites her nail and finally mutters that this is bad. Really, really bad. Blake turns to her mother and says that they can't just let it happen, and Callie agrees, but they don't even know where to start. Mistral's political connections with Menagerie are tenuous at best. Chances are they wouldn't listen to them about such a ridiculous sounding plan, and by the time they'd be convinced, the White Fang would already be bursting down the door. Callie pulls Ilya's notes over the table and begins to flick through them. Her brow creases as she goes, and finally she drops the pad and looks up, declaring they need to stop the Fang themselves. Blake blinks and asks what Callie means, and Callie says they'll have to talk with Gira, but the only solution that they're going to have is to go to Mistral themselves and make sure the plan doesn't happen. Blake asks what the four of them are going to do, and Callie quickly corrects her, not us, Menagerie. Ilya leans forward and says, "You can't be serious." And Callie shoots back, "Deadly." Blake asks how they're going to get there, how they're even going to find the White Fang. Blake could help somewhat, but they've no doubt moved their base. It'd be impossible to track them down before the attack, and by then the militia won't be much good. There'd be massive bloodshed in the streets. Innocents would die. Callie affirms what Blake is saying, but says they have someone who can lead them where they need to go, and eyes fall to Ilya. Ilya balks at the suggestion, saying she refuses. This plan of theirs? Doing that would literally start a civil war among the Faunus, and Ilya won't take part in that whatsoever. Blake continues to question her mom, compounding that Mistral might see this as an act of war. Callie is calm and says that when Gira learns of this plan, he'll burn every bridge, call in every marker in order to ensure that exact possibility doesn't happen. Blake shouts that the Elder Council will have both of their heads on a platter after that. Callie slams her hands on the table and stares Blake down. It's not about their political power, it's about the innocent lives at stake that Blake was so concerned about not just a minute ago. If the White Fang succeeded, how many people are going to suffer? What happens when Vale's CCT goes back online and they learn there's a new country? What happens when Atlas unlocks the door and comes rolling down on Mistral? Do they stop at Mistral? Or do they roll on to take Menagerie too, and the injured Vale, leaving Vacuole on its own against the literal world? This would be the precipice of a world war that doesn't end with a magnanimous king stepping down to bring world peace. This ends in tyranny, or worse, extinction. Blake falls back into her seat, the weight of the situation dawning on her. Callie shoots a glare to Ilya and demands she tell them where the White Fang are. Ilya pauses, thinks, and refuses, saying what they want is to have the Faunus destroy each other. Callie slams the table again and yells that if they let a world war happen, then they deserve to destroy each other. Stop thinking in us versus them, and realize there's no winner in all of this. Ilya is resolute, until Blake finally speaks up, having digested what was said, asking very softly, "Ilya, please." Ilya looks to Blake and her resolute face wavers. Seconds pass and she exhales, relenting. She makes one demand at the very least. She wants to go with them. If the Faunus are really going to war with each other, she wants to be able to say that she tried to stop it from happening. Blake thanks her and takes her hand, though Ilya pulls away, grimacing and saying, "This is the last time you get to pull that. Am I clear?" Blake is taken aback by the venom in Ilya's voice and has to think for a moment before nodding. "Yeah," she says, concerned. I didn't. Ilya stops her by saying, "Yeah." She never means it. It just comes naturally to her. Blake's eyes widen and she looks off to the side in shame. Callie, meanwhile, is flipping through Ilya's notes, telling Blake they need to leave and start planning. This is going to be the biggest step Menagerie has made on the global stage since its founding. They need to get every detail right. Blake looks back at Ilya before walking out the door. Ilya watches her leave, but then tears her eyes away and stares daggers at the table. We cut to a mirror shot of Adam looking down at plans on a map, his jawline grim. He stands and walks over to a series of boxes, pulling a clipboard from on top and flipping through the pages. The papers themselves indicate these boxes came from Vale, presumably some of the materials Roman stole prior to and during Volume 2. He looks over at one of the boxes and sees it branded with a Schnee Company logo, and he frustratedly throws the clipboard aside, trying to get control of his breathing. He opens the crate to look inside, and the world becomes foggy, like when he had his prior flashback. This one finds Adam at a warehouse, looking inside a similar crate when the warehouse manager catches him. The man yells at Adam for stealing from the crates, and a second later something can be seen swinging at Adam's face. There's a sound of metal hitting flesh and flesh melting down, as well as Adam's strangled cry of pain. Adam, back in the present, grips the left side of his face and stumbles towards the door. He bursts through it and makes his way to his room. He shirks his jacket, throwing it aside completely, and grabs a man with two souls from the table, replacing it with his mask. Adam then proceeds to curl up on the bed around the book, crying as he obscures his face from the audience. We fade to black on his pained sobs, ending the episode. And there we go, video 2 done. I'd like again to thank the Sketchy Huntsmen who worked on this video. Many of them have really been working their asses off to make this volume pop as well as it does. And this is probably the first instance in the history of Fixing where an entire episode has been represented by completely original art the whole way through. That said, there's still so much more on the way, and I'm eager to get to it. If it wasn't clear, there's no set schedule for these installments coming out, so be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that bell to keep up to date with all the uploads happening on this channel. You can also follow me on Twitter, at Raymond_McNeil, as well as the Sketchy Huntsman, at Sketchy Huntsman, where we'll tweet about the upcoming releases. That all said, if you had something that you liked about this video in particular, or something that you didn't like in particular, please let me know in the comments down below. Following the release of the rest of the volume, there's going to be a stream where I take the most serious and intense criticisms of the volume and address them to you directly. Whatever it be, please leave it in the comments down below. I'll be happy to address them in the future. And don't forget, if you like this content, please support the channel on Patreon. Seriously, I can't do this without you guys. That's all for now, and I'll catch you all on the flip side.